Chapter 13 The Wreck of the Lady Alice. The next morning at breakfast, Tarzan's place was vacant. Miss Strong was mildly curious, for Mr. Caldwell had always made it a point to wait that he might breakfast with her and her mother. As she was sitting on deck later, Monsieur Tarzan paused to exchange a half-dozen pleasant words with her. He seemed in most excellent spirits. His manner was the extreme of affability. As he passed on, Miss Strong thought what a very delightful man was Monsieur Tarzan. The day dragged heavily. She missed the quiet companionship of Mr. Caldwell. There had been something about him that had made the girl like him from the first. He had talked so entertainingly of the places he had seen, the peoples and their customs, the wild beasts. And he had always had a droll way of drawing striking comparisons between savage animals and civilized men that showed a considerable knowledge of the former, and a keen, though somewhat cynical, estimate of the latter. When Monsieur Tarzan stopped again to chat with her in the afternoon, she welcomed the break in the day's monotony. But she had begun to become seriously concerned in Mr. Caldwell's continued absence. Somehow she constantly associated it with the start she had had the night before, when the dark object fell past her port into the sea. Presently she broached the subject to Monsieur Tarzan. Had he seen Mr. Caldwell today? He had not. Why? He was not at breakfast as usual, nor have I seen him once since yesterday, explained the girl. Monsieur Tarzan was extremely solicitous. I did not have the pleasure of intimate acquaintance with Mr. Caldwell, he said. He seemed a most estimable gentleman, however. Can it be that he is indisposed and has remained in his stateroom? It would not be strange. No, replied the girl, it would not be strange, of course, but for some inexplicable reason I have one of those foolish feminine presentiments that all is not right with Mr. Caldwell. It is the strangest feeling. It is as though I knew that he was not on board the ship. Monsieur Tarzan laughed pleasantly. Mercy, my dear Miss Strong, he said, where in the world could he be then? We have not been within sight of land for days. Of course it is ridiculous of me, she admitted. And then, but I am not going to worry about it any longer. I am going to find out where Mr. Caldwell is, and she motioned to a passing steward. That may be more difficult than you imagine, my dear girl, thought Monsieur Tarzan, but aloud he said, by all means. Find Mr. Caldwell, please, she said to the steward, and tell him that his friends are much worried by his continued absence. You are very fond of Mr. Caldwell, suggested Monsieur Tarzan. I think he is splendid, replied the girl, and Mamma is perfectly infatuated with him. He is the sort of man with whom one has a feeling of perfect security. No one could help but have confidence in Mr. Caldwell. A moment later the steward returned to say that Mr. Caldwell was not in his stateroom. I cannot find him, Miss Strong, and he hesitated. I have learned that his berth was not occupied last night. I think that I had better report the matter to the captain. Most assuredly, exclaimed Miss Strong. I shall go with you to the captain myself. It is terrible. I know that something awful has happened. My presentiments were not false after all. It was a very frightened young woman and an excited steward who presented themselves before the captain a few moments later. He listened to their stories in silence, a look of concern marking his expression as the steward assured him that he had sought for the missing passenger in every part of the ship that a passenger might be expected to frequent. And are you sure, Miss Strong, that you saw a body fall overboard last night? He asked. There is not the slightest doubt about that, she answered. I cannot say that it was a human body. There was no outcry. It might have been only what I thought it was, a bundle of refuse. But if Mr. Caldwell is not found on board, I shall always be positive that it was he whom I saw fall past my port. The captain ordered an immediate and thorough search of the entire ship from stem to stern. No nook or cranny was to be overlooked. Miss Strong remained in his cabin, waiting the outcome of the quest. The captain asked her many questions, but she could tell him nothing about the missing man other than what she had herself seen during their brief acquaintance on shipboard. For the first time she suddenly realized how very little indeed Mr. Caldwell had told her about himself or his past life. That he had been born in Africa and educated in Paris was about all she knew, and this meager information had been the result of her surprise that an Englishman should speak English with such a marked French accent. Did he ever speak of any enemies? Asked the captain. Never. Was he acquainted with any of the other passengers? Only as he had been with me through the circumstance of casual meeting as fellow shipmates. Was he, in your opinion, Miss Strong, a man who drank to excess? I do not know that he drank at all. He certainly had not been drinking up to half an hour before I saw that body fall overboard, she answered, for I was with him on deck up to that time. It is very strange, said the captain. He did not look to me like a man who was subject to fainting spells or anything of that sort. And even had he been, it is scarcely credible that he should have fallen completely over the rail had he been taken with an attack. While leaning upon it, he would rather have fallen inside. Upon the deck, if he is not on board, Miss Strong, he was thrown overboard, and the fact that you heard no outcry would lead to the assumption that he was dead before he left the ship's deck, murdered. The girl shuddered. It was a full hour later that the first officer returned to report the outcome of the search. "Mr. Caldwell is not on board, sir," he said. "I fear that there is something more serious than accident here, Mr. Brentley," said the captain. "I wish that you would make a personal and very careful examination of Mr. Caldwell's effects, to ascertain if there is any clue to a motive either for suicide or murder. Sift the thing to the bottom." Aye, sir," responded Mr. Brentley, and left to commence his investigation. Hazel Strong was prostrated. For 2 days she did not leave her cabin, and when she finally ventured on deck she was very wan and white, with great, dark circles beneath her eyes. Waking or sleeping, it seemed that she constantly saw that dark body dropping, swift and silent, into the cold, grim sea. Shortly after her first appearance on deck following the tragedy, Monsieur Tarzan joined her with many expressions of kindly solicitude. "Oh, but it is terrible, Miss Strong," he said. "I cannot rid my mind of it." "Nor I," said the girl wearily. "I feel that he might have been saved had I but given the alarm." "You must not reproach yourself, my dear Miss Strong," urged Monsieur Tarzan. "It was in no way your fault. Another would have done as you did. Who would think that, because something fell into the sea from a ship, that it must necessarily be a man? Nor would the outcome have been different had you given an alarm. For a while they would have doubted your story, thinking it but the nervous hallucination of a woman. Had you insisted, it would have been too late to have rescued him by the time the ship could have been brought to a stop, and the boats lowered and rowed back miles in search of the unknown spot where the tragedy had occurred. No. You must not censure yourself. You have done more than any other of us for poor Mr. Caldwell. You were the only one to miss him. It was you who instituted the search." The girl could not help but feel grateful to him for his kind and encouraging words. He was with her often, almost constantly, for the remainder of the voyage, and she grew to like him very much indeed. Monsieur Tarzan had learned that the beautiful Miss Strong of Baltimore was an American heiress, a very wealthy girl in her own right, and with future prospects that quite took his breath away when he contemplated them. And since he spent most of his time in that delectable pastime, it is a wonder that he breathed at all. It had been Monsieur Tarzan's intention to leave the ship at the first port they touched after the disappearance of Tarzan. Did he not have in his coat pocket the thing he had taken passage upon this very boat to obtain? There was nothing more to detain him here. He could not return to the continent fast enough that he might board the first express for St. Petersburg. But now another idea had obtruded itself, and was rapidly crowding his original intentions into the background. That American fortune was not to be sneezed at, nor was its possessor a whit less attractive. Sapristi, but she would cause a sensation in St. Petersburg, and he would too, with the assistance of her inheritance. After Monsieur Tarzan had squandered a few $1,000,000, he discovered that the vocation was so entirely to his liking that he would continue on down to Cape Town, where he suddenly decided that he had pressing engagements that might detain him there for some time. Miss Strong had told him that she and her mother were to visit the latter's brother there. They had not decided upon the duration of their stay, and it would probably run into months. She was delighted when she found that Monsieur Tarzan was to be there also. "I hope that we shall be able to continue our acquaintance," she said. "You must call upon Mamma and me as soon as we are settled." Monsieur Tarzan was delighted at the prospect, and lost no time in saying so. Mrs. Strong was not quite so favorably impressed by him as her daughter. "I do not know why I should distrust him," she said to Hazel one day as they were discussing him. "He seems a perfect gentleman in every respect, but sometimes there is something about his eyes, a fleeting expression which I cannot describe, but which, when I see it, gives me a very uncanny feeling." The girl laughed. "You are a silly dear, Mamma," she said. "I suppose so, but I am sorry that we have not poor Mr. Caldwell for company instead." "And I too," replied her daughter. Monsieur Tarzan became a frequent visitor at the home of Hazel Strong's uncle in Cape Town. His attentions were very marked, but they were so punctiliously arranged to meet the girl's every wish that she came to depend upon him more and more. Did she or her mother or a cousin require an escort, was there a little friendly service to be rendered, the genial and ubiquitous Monsieur Tarzan was always available. Her uncle and his family grew to like him for his unfailing courtesy and willingness to be of service. Monsieur Tarzan was becoming indispensable. At length, feeling the moment propitious, he proposed. Miss Strong was startled. She did not know what to say. "I had never thought that you cared for me in any such way," she told him. "I have looked upon you always as a very dear friend. I shall not give you my answer now. Forget that you have asked me to be your wife. Let us go on as we have been, then I can consider you from an entirely different angle for a time. It may be that I shall discover that my feeling for you is more than friendship. I certainly have not thought for a moment that I loved you." This arrangement was perfectly satisfactory to Monsieur Tarzan. He deeply regretted that he had been hasty, but he had loved her for so long a time, and so devotedly, that he thought that everyone must know it. "From the first time I saw you, Hazel," he said, "I have loved you. I am willing to wait, for I am certain that so great and pure a love as mine will be rewarded. All that I care to know is that you do not love another. Will you tell me?" "I have never been in love in my life," she replied, and he was quite satisfied. On the way home that night, he purchased a steam yacht and built a $1 million villa on the Black Sea. The next day, Hazel Strong enjoyed one of the happiest surprises of her life. She ran face to face upon Jane Porter as she was coming out of a jeweler's shop. "Why, Jane Porter," she exclaimed, "where in the world did you drop from? Why, I can't believe my own eyes." "Well, of all things," cried the equally astonished Jane, "and here I have been wasting whole reams of perfectly good imagination picturing you in Baltimore, the very idea," and she threw her arms about her friend once more and kissed her a dozen times. By the time mutual explanations had been made, Hazel knew that Lord Tennington's yacht had put in at Cape Town for at least a week's stay, and at the end of that time was to continue on her voyage, this time up the west coast and so back to England. "Where," concluded Jane, "I am to be married." "Then you are not married yet?" asked Hazel. "Not yet," replied Jane. "And then, quite irrelevantly, I wish England were 1,000,000 miles from here." Visits were exchanged between the yacht and Hazel's relatives. Dinners were arranged, and trips into the surrounding country to entertain the visitors. Monsieur Tarzan was a welcome guest at every function. He gave a dinner himself to the men of the party, and managed to ingratiate himself in the good will of Lord Tennington by many little acts of hospitality. Monsieur Tarzan had heard dropped a hint of something which might result from this unexpected visit of Lord Tennington's yacht, and he wanted to be counted in on it. Once, when he was alone with the Englishman, he took occasion to make it quite plain that his engagement to Miss Strong was to be announced immediately upon their return to America, but not a word of it, my dear Tennington, not a word of it. "Certainly, I quite understand, my dear fellow," Tennington had replied, "but you are to be congratulated, ripping girl, don't you know, really?" The next day it came. Mrs. Strong, Hazel, and Monsieur Tarzan were Lord Tennington's guests aboard his yacht. Mrs. Strong had been telling them how much she had enjoyed her visit at Cape Town, and that she regretted that a letter just received from her attorneys in Baltimore had necessitated her cutting her visit shorter than they had intended. "When do you sail?" asked Tennington. "The first of the week, I think," she replied. "Indeed," exclaimed Monsieur Tarzan, "I am very fortunate. I, too, have found that I must return at once, and now I shall have the honor of accompanying and serving you." "That is nice of you, Monsieur Tarzan," replied Mrs. Strong. "I am sure that we shall be glad to place ourselves under your protection," but in the bottom of her heart was the wish that they might escape him. Why, she could not have told. "By Jove," ejaculated Lord Tennington, a moment later. "Bully idea, by Jove." "Yes, Tennington, of course," ventured Clayton. "It must be a bully idea if you had it, but what the deuce is it? Going to steam to China via the South Pole?" "Oh, I say now, Clayton," returned Tennington, "you needn't be so rough on a fellow. Just because you didn't happen to suggest this trip yourself, you've acted a regular bounder ever since we sailed." "No, sir," he continued, "it's a bully idea, and you'll all say so. It's to take Mrs. Strong and Miss Strong and Miss Strong and too, if he'll come, as far as England with us on the yacht. Now, isn't that a corker?" "Forgive me, Tenny, old boy," cried Clayton. "It certainly is a corking idea. I never should have suspected you of it. You're quite sure it's original, are you?" "And we'll sail the first of the week, or any other time that suits your convenience, Mrs. Strong," concluded the big-hearted Englishman, as though the thing were all arranged except the sailing date. "Mercy, Lord Tennington, you haven't even given us an opportunity to thank you, much less decide whether we shall be able to accept your generous invitation," said Mrs. Strong. Why, of course you'll come, responded Tennington. We'll make as good time as any passenger boat, and you'll be fully as comfortable, and anyway, we all want you and won't take no for an answer. And so it was settled that they should sail the following Monday. 2 days out, the girls were sitting in Hazel's cabin, looking at some prints she had had finished in Cape Town. They represented all the pictures she had taken since she had left America, and the girls were both engrossed in them, Jane asking many questions and Hazel keeping up a perfect torrent of comment and explanation of the various scenes and people. And here she said suddenly, "Here's a man you know. Poor fellow, I have so often intended asking you about him, but I never have been able to think of it." When we were together she was holding the little print, so that Jane did not see the face of the man it portrayed. "His name was John Caldwell," continued Hazel. "Do you recall him? He said that he met you in America. He is an Englishman." "I do not recollect the name," replied Jane. "Let me see the picture." "The poor fellow was lost overboard on our trip down the coast," she said, as she handed the print to Jane. "Lost over why, Hazel? Hazel, don't tell me that he is dead, drowned at sea. Hazel, why don't you say that you are joking?" And before the astonished Miss Strong could catch her, Jane Porter had slipped to the floor in a swoon. After Hazel had restored her chum to consciousness, she sat looking at her for a long time before either spoke. "I did not know," Jane said, Hazel, in a constrained voice, "that you knew Mr. Caldwell so intimately that his death could prove such a shock to you." "John Caldwell?" questioned Miss Porter. "You do not mean to tell me that you do not know who this man was, Hazel?" "Why, yes, Jane, I know perfectly well who he was. His name was John Caldwell. He was from London." "Oh, Hazel, I wish I could believe it," moaned the girl. "I wish I could believe it, but those features are burned so deep into my memory and my heart that I should recognize them anywhere in the world from among 1,000 others who might appear identical to anyone but me." "What do you mean, Jane?" cried Hazel, now thoroughly alarmed. "Who do you think it is?" "I don't think, Hazel. I know that that is a picture of Tarzan of the apes." "Jane, I cannot be mistaken." "Oh, Hazel, are you sure that he is dead? Can there be no mistake?" "I am afraid not, dear," answered Hazel sadly. "I wish I could think that you are mistaken, but now 101 little pieces of corroborative evidence occur to me that meant nothing to me while I thought that he was John Caldwell of London. He said that he had been born in Africa and educated in France." "Yes, that would be true," murmured Jane Porter dully. "The first officer who searched his luggage found nothing to identify John Caldwell of London. Practically all his belongings had been made or purchased in Paris. Everything that bore an initial was marked either with a T alone or with JCT. We thought that he was traveling incognito under his first two names, the JC standing for John Caldwell. Tarzan of the apes took the name Gene C. Tarzan, said Jane, in the same lifeless monotone. And he is dead. Oh, Hazel. It is horrible. He died all alone in this terrible ocean. It is unbelievable that that brave heart should have ceased to beat, that those mighty muscles are quiet and cold forever, that he who was the personification of life and health and manly strength should be the prey of slimy, crawling things. But she could go no further, and with a little moan she buried her head in her arms and sank sobbing to the floor. For days Miss Porter was ill and would see no one except Hazel and the faithful Esmeralda. When at last she came on deck, all were struck by the sad change that had taken place in her. She was no longer the alert, vivacious American beauty who had charmed and delighted all who came in contact with her. Instead, she was a very quiet and sad little girl with an expression of hopeless wistfulness that none but Hazel Strong could interpret. The entire party strove their utmost to cheer and amuse her, but all to no avail. Occasionally the jolly Lord Tennington would wring a wan smile from her, but for the most part she sat with wide eyes looking out across the sea. With Jane Porter's illness, one misfortune after another seemed to attack the yacht. First an engine broke down and they drifted for 2 days while temporary repairs were being made. Then a squall struck them unaware that carried overboard nearly everything above deck that was portable. Later 2 of the seamen fell to fighting in the forecastle, with the result that one of them was badly wounded with a knife and the other had to be put in irons. Then, to cap the climax, the mate fell overboard at night and was drowned before help could reach him. The yacht cruised about the spot for 10 hours, but no sign of the man was seen after he disappeared from the deck into the sea. Every member of the crew and guests was gloomy and depressed after these series of misfortunes. All were apprehensive of worse to come, And this was especially true of the seamen who recalled all sorts of terrible omens and warnings that had occurred during the early part of the voyage, and which they could now clearly translate into the precursors of some grim and terrible tragedy to come. Nor did the croakers have long to wait. The second night after the drowning of the mate, the little yacht was suddenly racked from stem to stern. About 1 o'clock in the morning there was a terrific impact that threw the slumbering guests and crew from berth and bunk. A mighty shudder ran through the frail craft. She lay far over to starboard. The engine stopped. For a moment she hung there with her decks at an angle of 45 degrees, then with a sullen, rending sound, she slipped back into the sea and righted. Instantly the men rushed upon deck, followed closely by the women. Though the night was cloudy, there was little wind or sea, nor was it so dark but that just off the port bow a black mass could be discerned floating low in the water. A derelict was the terse explanation of the officer of the watch. Presently the engineer hurried on deck in search of the captain. "That patch we put on the cylinder head's blown out, sir," he reported, "and she's making water fast for our day on the port bow." An instant later a seaman rushed up from below. "My God," he cried, "her whole bleeding bottom's ripped out. She can't float 20 minutes. "Shut up," roared Tennington. "Ladies, go below and get some of your things together. It may not be so bad as that, but we may have to take to the boats. It will be safer to be prepared. Go at once, please. And Captain Gerald, send some competent man below, please, to ascertain the exact extent of the damage. In the meantime, I might suggest that you have the boats provisioned." The calm, low voice of the owner did much to reassure the entire party, and a moment later all were occupied with the duties he had suggested. By the time the ladies had returned to the deck, the rapid provisioning of the boats had been about completed, and a moment later the officer who had gone below had returned to report. But his opinion was scarcely needed to assure the huddled group of men and women that the end of the Lady Alice was at hand. "Well, sir," said the captain as his officer hesitated. "I dislike to frighten the ladies, sir," he said, "but she can't float a dozen minutes, in my opinion. There's a hole in her you could drive a bally cow through, sir." For 5 minutes the Lady Alice had been settling rapidly by the bow. Already her stern loomed high in the air, and foothold on the deck was of the most precarious nature. She carried 4 boats, and these were all filled and lowered away in safety. As they pulled rapidly from the stricken little vessel, Jane Porter turned to have one last look at her. Just then there came a loud crash and an ominous rumbling and pounding from the heart of the ship. Her machinery had broken loose and was dashing its way toward the bow, tearing out partitions and bulkheads as it went. The stern rose rapidly high above them. For a moment she seemed to pause there, a vertical shaft protruding from the bosom of the ocean, and then swiftly she dove headforemost beneath the waves. In one of the boats, the brave Lord Tennington wiped a tear from his eye. He had not seen a fortune in money go down forever into the sea, but a dear, beautiful friend whom he had loved. At last the long night broke, and a tropical sun smote down upon the rolling water. Jane Porter had dropped into a fitful slumber. The fierce light of the sun upon her upturned face awoke her. She looked about her. In the boat with her were 3 sailors, Clayton and Monsieur Tarzan. Then she looked for the other boats, but as far as the eye could reach there was nothing to break the fearful monotony of that waste of waters. They were alone in a small boat upon the broad Atlantic. Chapter 14. Back to the primitive. As Tarzan struck the water, his first impulse was to swim clear of the ship and possible danger from her propellers. He knew whom to thank for his present predicament, and as he lay in the sea, just supporting himself by a gentle movement of his hands, his chief emotion was one of chagrin that he had been so easily bested by Rokoff. He lay thus for some time, watching the receding and rapidly diminishing lights of the steamer without it ever once occurring to him to call for help. He never had called for help in his life, and so it is not strange that he did not think of it now. Always had he depended upon his own prowess and resourcefulness, nor had there ever been since the days of Cala any to answer an appeal for succor. When it did occur to him, it was too late. There was, thought Tarzan, a possible 1 chance in 100,000 that he might be picked up, and an even smaller chance that he would reach land, so he determined that, to combine what slight chances there were, he would swim slowly in the direction of the coast. The ship might have been closer in than he had known. His strokes were long and easy. It would be many hours before those giant muscles would commence to feel fatigue. As he swam, guided toward the east by the stars, he noticed that he felt the weight of his shoes, and so he removed them. His trousers went next, and he would have removed his coat at the same time but for the precious papers in its pocket. To assure himself that he still had them, he slipped his hand in to feel, but to his consternation they were gone. Now he knew that something more than revenge had prompted Rukov to pitch him overboard. The Russian had managed to obtain possession of the papers Tarzan had wrested from him at Busada. The ape-man swore softly and let his coat and shirt sink into the Atlantic. Before many hours he had divested himself of his remaining garments and was swimming easily and unencumbered toward the east. The first faint evidence of dawn was paling the stars ahead of him when the dim outlines of a low-lying black mass loomed up directly in his track. A few strong strokes brought him to its side. It was the bottom of a wave-washed derelict. Tarzan clambered upon it. He would rest there until daylight at least. He had no intention to remain there inactive, a prey to hunger and thirst. If he must die, he preferred dying in action while making some semblance of an attempt to save himself. The sea was quiet, so that the wreck had only a gently undulating motion. That was nothing to the swimmer who had had no sleep for 20 hours. Tarzan of the Apes curled up upon the slimy timbers and was soon asleep. The heat of the sun awoke him early in the forenoon. His first conscious sensation was of thirst, which grew almost to the proportions of suffering with full returning consciousness, but a moment later it was forgotten in the joy of two almost simultaneous discoveries. The first was a mass of wreckage floating beside the derelict, in the midst of which, bottom up, rose and fell an overturned lifeboat. The other was the faint, dim line of a far distant shore showing on the horizon in the east. Tarzan dove into the water and swam around the wreck to the lifeboat. The cool ocean refreshed him almost as much as would a draught of water, so that it was with renewed vigor that he brought the smaller boat alongside the derelict, and after many Herculean efforts, succeeded in dragging it onto the slimy ship's bottom. There he righted and examined it. The boat was quite sound, and a moment later floated upright alongside the wreck. Then Tarzan selected several pieces of wreckage that might answer him as paddles, and presently was making good headway toward the far-off shore. It was late in the afternoon by the time he came close enough to distinguish objects on land, or to make out the contour of the shoreline. Before him lay what appeared to be the entrance to a little, landlocked harbor. The wooded point to the north was strangely familiar. Could it be possible that fate had thrown him up at the very threshold of his own beloved jungle? But as the bow of his boat entered the mouth of the harbor, the last shred of doubt was cleared away, for there before him upon the farther shore, under the shadows of his primeval forest, stood his own cabin, built before his birth by the hand of his long-dead father, John Clayton, Lord Greystoke. With long sweeps of his giant muscles, Tarzan sent the little craft speeding toward the beach. Its prow had scarcely touched when the ape-man leaped to shore. His heart beat fast in joy and exultation as each long-familiar object came beneath his roving eyes: the cabin, the beach, the little brook, the dense jungle, the black, impenetrable forest. The myriad birds in their brilliant plumage, the gorgeous tropical blooms upon the festooned creepers falling in great loops from the giant trees. Tarzan of the Apes had come into his own again, and that all the world might know it, he threw back his young head and gave voice to the fierce, wild challenge of his tribe. For a moment silence reigned upon the jungle, and then, low and weird, came an answering challenge. It was the deep roar of Numa, the lion, and from a great distance, faintly, the fearsome answering bellow of a bull ape. Tarzan went to the brook first and slaked his thirst. Then he approached his cabin. The door was still closed and latched as he and D'Arnot had left it. He raised the latch and entered. Nothing had been disturbed. There were the table, the bed, and the little crib built by his father, the shelves and cupboards just as they had stood for over 23 years, just as he had left them nearly 2 years before. His eyes satisfied, Tarzan's stomach began to call aloud for attention. The pangs of hunger suggested a search for food. There was nothing in the cabin, nor had he any weapons, but upon a wall hung one of his old grass ropes. It had been many times broken and spliced, so that he had discarded it for a better one long before. Tarzan wished that he had a knife. Well, unless he was mistaken, he should have that, and a spear and bows and arrows before another sun had set. The rope would take care of that, and in the meantime it must be made to procure food for him. He coiled it carefully, and throwing it about his shoulder went out, closing the door behind him. Close to the cabin the jungle commenced, and into it Tarzan of the Apes plunged, wary and noiseless, once more a savage beast hunting its food. For a time he kept to the ground, but finally, discovering no spoor indicative of nearby meat, he took to the trees. With the first dizzy swing from tree to tree, all the old joy of living swept over him. Vain regrets and dull heartache were forgotten. Now was he living. Now, indeed, was the true happiness of perfect freedom his. Who would go back to the stifling, wicked cities of civilized man when the mighty reaches of the great jungle offered peace and liberty? Not he. While it was yet light, Tarzan came to a drinking place by the side of a jungle river. There was a ford there, and for countless ages the beasts of the forest had come down to drink at this spot. Here of a night might always be found either Saber or Numa crouching in the dense foliage of the surrounding jungle awaiting an antelope or a water buck for their meal. Here came Horta the boar to water, and here came Tarzan of the apes to make a kill, for he was very empty. On a low branch he squatted above the trail. For an hour he waited. It was growing dark. A little to one side of the ford in the densest thicket he heard the faint sound of padded feet, and the brushing of a huge body against tall grasses and tangled creepers. None other than Tarzan might have heard it, but the ape-man heard and translated it was Numa, the lion, on the same errand as himself. Tarzan smiled. Presently he heard an animal approaching warily along the trail toward the drinking place. A moment more and it came in view. It was Horta the boar. Here was delicious meat, and Tarzan's mouth watered. The grasses where Numa lay were very still now, ominously still. Horta passed beneath Tarzan a few more steps and he would be within the radius of Numa's spring. Tarzan could imagine how old Numa's eyes were shining, how he was already sucking in his breath for the awful roar which would freeze his prey for the brief instant between the moment of the spring and the sinking of terrible fangs into splintering bones. But as Numa gathered himself, a slender rope flew through the air from the low branches of a nearby tree. A noose settled about Horta's neck. There was a frightened grunt, a squeal, and then Numa saw his quarry drag backward up the trail, and as he sprang, Horta, the boar, soared upward beyond his clutches into the tree above, and a mocking face looked down and laughed into his own. Then indeed did Numa roar. Angry, threatening, hungry, he paced back and forth beneath the taunting ape-man. Now he stopped, and rising on his hind legs against the stem of the tree that held his enemy, sharpened his huge claws upon the bark, tearing out great pieces that laid bare the white wood beneath. And in the meantime Tarzan had dragged the struggling Horta to the limb beside him. Sinewy fingers completed the work the choking noose had commenced. The ape-man had no knife, but nature had equipped him with the means of tearing his food from the quivering flank of his prey, and gleaming teeth sank into the succulent flesh, while the raging lion looked on from below as another enjoyed the dinner that he had thought already his. It was quite dark by the time Tarzan had gorged himself. Ah, but it had been delicious. Never had he quite accustomed himself to the ruined flesh that civilized men had served him, and in the bottom of his savage heart there had constantly been the craving for the warm meat of the fresh kill and the rich red blood. He wiped his bloody hands upon a bunch of leaves, slung the remains of his kill across his shoulder, and swung off through the middle terrace of the forest toward his cabin, and at the same instant Jane Porter and William Cecil Clayton arose from a sumptuous dinner upon the Lady Alice, thousands of miles to the east, in the Indian Ocean. Beneath Tarzan walked Numa, the lion, and when the ape-man deigned to glance downward he caught occasional glimpses of the baleful green eyes following through the darkness. Numa did not roar now. Instead he moved stealthily, like the shadow of a great cat, but yet he took no step that did not reach the sensitive ears of the ape-man. Tarzan wondered if he would stalk him to his cabin door. He hoped not, for that would mean a night's sleep curled in the crotch of a tree, and he much preferred the bed of grasses within his own abode. But he knew just the tree and the most comfortable crotch if necessity demanded that he sleep out. 100 times in the past some great jungle cat had followed him home and compelled him to seek shelter in this same tree, until another mood or the rising sun had sent his enemy away. But presently Numa gave up the chase and, with a series of blood-curdling moans and roars, turned angrily back in search of another and an easier dinner, so Tarzan came to his cabin unattended, and a few moments later was curled up in the mildewed remnants of what had once been a bed of grasses. Thus easily did Monsieur Jean see Tarzan slough the thin skin of his artificial civilization and sink happy and contented into the deep sleep of the wild beast that has fed to repletion. Yet a woman's yes would have bound him to that other life forever, and made the thought of this savage existence repulsive. Tarzan slept late into the following forenoon, for he had been very tired from the labors and exertion of the long night and day upon the ocean, and the jungle jaunt that had brought into play muscles that he had scarce used for nearly 2 years. When he awoke, he ran to the brook first to drink. Then he took a plunge into the sea, swimming about for a quarter of an hour. Afterward he returned to his cabin and breakfasted off the flesh of Horta. This done, he buried the balance of the carcass in the soft earth outside the cabin for his evening meal. Once more he took his rope and vanished into the jungle. This time he hunted nobler quarryman, although had you asked him his own opinion he could have named a dozen other denizens of the jungle, which he considered far the superiors in nobility of the men he hunted. Today Tarzan was in quest of weapons. He wondered if the women and children had remained in Mbonga's village after the punitive expedition from the French cruiser had massacred all the warriors in revenge for D'Arnaut's supposed death. He hoped that he should find warriors there, for he knew not how long a quest he should have to make were the village deserted. The ape-man traveled swiftly through the forest, and about noon came to the site of the village, but to his disappointment found that the jungle had overgrown the plantain fields and that the thatched huts had fallen in decay. There was no sign of man. He clambered about among the ruins for half an hour, hoping that he might discover some forgotten weapon, but his search was without fruit, and so he took up his quest once more, following up the stream, which flowed from a southeasterly direction. He knew that near fresh water he would be most likely to find another settlement. As he traveled, he hunted as he had hunted with his ape people in the past, as Kala had taught him to hunt, turning over rotted logs to find some toothsome vermin, running high into the trees to rob a bird's nest, or pouncing upon a tiny rodent with the quickness of a cat. There were other things that he ate too, but the less detailed the account of an ape's diet, the better, and Tarzan was again an ape, the same fierce, brutal anthropoid that Kala had taught him to be, and that he had been for the first 20 years of his life. Occasionally he smiled as he recalled some friend who might even at the moment be sitting placid and immaculate within the precincts of his select Parisian club, just as Tarzan had sat but a few months before, and then he would stop, as though turned suddenly to stone as the gentle breeze carried to his trained nostrils the scent of some new prey or a formidable enemy. That night he slept far inland from his cabin, securely wedged into the crotch of a giant tree, swaying 100 feet above the ground. He had eaten heartily again, this time from the flesh of Bara, the deer, who had fallen prey to his quick noose. Early the next morning he resumed his journey, always following the course of the stream. For 3 days he continued his quest, until he had come to a part of the jungle in which he never before had been. Occasionally upon the higher ground the forest was much thinner, and in the far distance through the trees he could see ranges of mighty mountains, with wide plains in the foreground. Here in the open spaces were new game, countless antelope and vast herds of zebra. Tarzan was entranced. He would make a long visit to this new world. On the morning of the 4th day his nostrils were suddenly surprised by a faint new scent. It was the scent of man, but yet a long way off. The ape-man thrilled with pleasure. Every sense was on the alert as with crafty stealth he moved quickly through the trees, upwind in the direction of his prey. Presently he came upon it, a lone warrior treading softly through the jungle. Tarzan followed close above his quarry, waiting for a clearer space in which to hurl his rope. As he stalked the unconscious man, new thoughts presented themselves to the ape-man, thoughts born of the refining influences of civilization and of its cruelties. It came to him that seldom, if ever, did civilized man kill a fellow being without some pretext, however slight. It was true that Tarzan wished this man's weapons and ornaments, but was it necessary to take his life to obtain them? The longer he thought about it, the more repugnant became the thought of taking human life needlessly, and thus it happened that, while he was trying to decide just what to do, they had come to a little clearing, at the far side of which lay a palisaded village of beehive huts. As the warrior emerged from the forest, Tarzan caught a fleeting glimpse of a tawny hide worming its way through the matted jungle grasses in his wake. It was Numa, the lion. He, too, was stalking the black man. With the instant that Tarzan realized the native's danger, his attitude toward his erstwhile prey altered completely. Now he was a fellow man threatened by a common enemy. Numa was about to charge. There was little time in which to compare various methods or weigh the probable results of any. And then a number of things happened. Almost simultaneously the lion sprang from his ambush toward the retreating black. Tarzan cried out in warning, and the black turned just in time to see Numa halted in mid-flight by a slender strand of grass rope, the noosed end of which had fallen cleanly about his neck. The ape-man had acted so quickly that he had been unable to prepare himself to withstand the strain and shock of Numa's great weight upon the rope, and so it was that, though the rope stopped the beast before his mighty talons could fasten themselves in the flesh of the black. The strain overbalanced Tarzan, who came tumbling to the ground not 6 paces from the infuriated animal. Like lightning, Numa turned upon this new enemy, and defenseless as he was, Tarzan of the Apes was nearer to death that instant than he ever before had been. It was the black who saved him. The warrior realized in an instant that he owed his life to this strange white man, and he also saw that only a miracle could save his preserver from those fierce yellow fangs that had been so near to his own flesh. With the quickness of thought, his spear arm flew back, and then shot forward with all the force of the sinewy muscles that rolled beneath the shimmering ebon hide. True to its mark, the iron-shod weapon flew, transfixing Numa's sleek carcass from the right groin to beneath the left shoulder. With a hideous scream of rage and pain, the brute turned again upon the black. A dozen paces he had gone when Tarzan's rope brought him to a stand once more. Then he wheeled again upon the ape-man, only to feel the painful prick of a barbed arrow as it sank half its length in his quivering flesh. Again he stopped, and by this time Tarzan had run twice around the stem of a great tree with his rope and made the end fast. The black saw the trick and grinned, but Tarzan knew that Numa must be quickly finished before those mighty teeth had found and parted the slender cord that held him. It was a matter of but an instant to reach the black's side and drag his long knife from its scabbard. Then he signed the warrior to continue to shoot arrows into the great beast while he attempted to close in upon him with the knife, so as one tantalized upon one side, the other sneaked cautiously in upon the other. Numa was furious. He raised his voice in a perfect frenzy of shrieks, growls, and hideous moans, the while he reared upon his hind legs in futile attempt to reach first one and then the other of his tormentors. But at length the agile ape-man saw his chance and rushed in upon the beast's left side behind the mighty shoulder. A giant arm encircled the tawny throat, and a long blade sank once, true as a die, into the fierce heart. Then Tarzan arose, and the black man and the white looked into each other's eyes across the body of their kill, and the black made the sign of peace and friendship, and Tarzan of the Apes answered in kind. Chapter 15. From Ape to Savage. The noise of their battle with Numa had drawn an excited horde of savages from the nearby village, and a moment after the lion's death, the two men were surrounded by lithe, ebon warriors, gesticulating and jabbering 1,000 questions that drowned each ventured reply. And then the women came, and the children eager, curious, and at sight of Tarzan more questioning than ever. The ape-man's new friend finally succeeded in making himself heard, and when he had done talking, the men and women of the village vied with one another in doing honor to the strange creature who had saved their fellow and battled single-handed with fierce Numa. At last they led him back to their village, where they brought him gifts of fowl and goats and cooked food. When he pointed to their weapons, the warriors hastened to fetch spear, shield, arrows, and a bow. His friend of the encounter presented him with the knife with which he had killed Numa. There was nothing in all the village he could not have had for the asking. How much easier this was, thought Tarzan, than murder and robbery to supply his wants. How close he had been to killing this man whom he never had seen before, and who now was manifesting by every primitive means at his command friendship and affection for his would-be slayer. Tarzan of the Apes was ashamed. Hereafter he would at least wait until he knew men deserved it before he thought of killing them. The idea recalled Rokoff to his mind. He wished that he might have the Russian to himself in the dark jungle for a few minutes. There was a man who deserved killing if ever anyone did. And if he could have seen Rokoff at that moment as he assiduously bent every endeavor to the pleasant task of ingratiating himself into the affections of the beautiful Miss Strong, he would have longed more than ever to mete out to the man the fate he deserved. Tarzan's first night with the savages was devoted to a wild orgy in his honor. There was feasting, for the hunters had brought in an antelope and a zebra as trophies of their skill, and gallons of the weak native beer were consumed. As the warriors danced in the firelight, Tarzan was again impressed by the symmetry of their figures and the regularity of their features. The flat noses and thick lips of the typical West Coast savage were entirely missing. In repose, the faces of the men were intelligent and dignified, those of the women ofttimes prepossessing. It was during this dance that the ape-man first noticed that some of the men and many of the women wore ornaments of gold, principally anklets and armlets of great weight, apparently beaten out of the solid metal. When he expressed a wish to examine one of these, the owner removed it from her person and insisted, through the medium of signs, that Tarzan accept it as a gift. A close scrutiny of the bauble convinced the ape-man that the article was of virgin gold, and he was surprised, for it was the first time that he had ever seen golden ornaments among the savages of Africa, other than the trifling baubles those near the coast had purchased or stolen from Europeans. He tried to ask them from whence the metal came, but he could not make them understand. When the dance was done, Tarzan signified his intention to leave them, but they almost implored him to accept the hospitality of a great hut, which the chief set apart for his sole use. He tried to explain that he would return in the morning, but they could not understand. When he finally walked away from them toward the side of the village opposite the gate, they were still further mystified as to his intentions. Tarzan, however, knew just what he was about. In the past, he had had experience with the rodents and vermin that infest every native village, and while he was not over-scrupulous about such matters, he much preferred the fresh air of the swaying trees to the fetid atmosphere of a hut. The natives followed him to where a great tree overhung the palisade, and as Tarzan leapt for a lower branch and disappeared into the foliage above, precisely after the manner of Manu the monkey, there were loud exclamations of surprise and astonishment. For half an hour they called to him to return, but as he did not answer them, they at last desisted, and sought the sleeping mats within their huts. Tarzan went back into the forest a short distance until he had found a tree suited to his primitive requirements, and then, curling himself in a great crotch, he fell immediately into a deep sleep. The following morning he dropped into the village street as suddenly as he had disappeared the preceding night. For a moment the natives were startled and afraid, but when they recognized their guest of the night before, they welcomed him with shouts and laughter. That day he accompanied a party of warriors to the nearby plains on a great hunt, and so dexterous did they find this white man with their own crude weapons that another bond of respect and admiration was thereby wrought. For weeks Tarzan lived with his savage friends, hunting buffalo, antelope, and zebra for meat, and elephant for ivory. Quickly he learned their simple speech, their native customs, and the ethics of their wild, primitive tribal life. He found that they were not cannibals, that they looked with loathing and contempt upon men who ate men. Busuli, the warrior whom he had stalked to the village, told him many of the tribal legends, how, many years before, his people had come many long marches from the north, how once they had been a great and powerful tribe, and how the slave raiders had wrought such havoc among them with their death-dealing guns that they had been reduced to a mere remnant of their former numbers and power. "They hunted us down as one hunts a fierce beast," said Busuli. "There was no mercy in them. When it was not slaves they thought it was ivory, but usually it was both. Our men were killed and our women driven away like sheep. We fought against them for many years. But our arrows and spears could not prevail against the sticks which spit fire and lead and death to many times the distance that our mightiest warrior could place an arrow. At last, when my father was a young man, the Arabs came again, but our warriors saw them a long way off in Chowambi. Who was chief then told his people to gather up their belongings and come away with him, that he would lead them far to the south until they found a spot to which the Arab raiders did not come. And they did as he bid, carrying all their belongings, including many tusks of ivory. For months they wandered, suffering untold hardships and privations, for much of the way was through dense jungle and across mighty mountains, but finally they came to this spot. And although they sent parties farther on to search for an even better location, none has ever been found." "And the raiders have never found you here?" asked Tarzan. "About a year ago a small party of Arabs and Menuema stumbled upon us, but we drove them off, killing many. For days we followed them, stalking them for the wild beasts they are, picking them off one by one, until but a handful remained, but these escaped us." As Busuli talked, he fingered a heavy gold armlet that encircled the glossy hide of his left arm. Tarzan's eyes had been upon the ornament, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Presently he recalled the question he had tried to ask when he first came to the tribe, the question he could not at that time make them understand. For weeks he had forgotten so trivial a thing as gold, for he had been for the time a truly primeval man with no thought beyond today. But of a sudden the sight of gold awakened the sleeping civilization that was in him, and with it came the lust for wealth. That lesson Tarzan had learned well in his brief experience of the ways of civilized man. He knew that gold meant power and pleasure. He pointed to the bauble. "From whence came the yellow metal?" Busuli, he asked. The black pointed toward the southeast. "A moon's march away, maybe more," he replied. "Have you been there?" asked Tarzan. "No, but some of our people were there years ago when my father was yet a young man. One of the parties that searched farther for a location for the tribe when first they settled here came upon a strange people who wore many ornaments of yellow metal. Their spears were tipped with it, as were their arrows, and they cooked in vessels made all of solid metal like my armlet. They lived in a great village in huts that were built of stone and surrounded by a great wall. They were very fierce, rushing out and falling upon our warriors before ever they learned that their errand was a peaceful one. Our men were few in number, but they held their own at the top of a little rocky hill until the fierce people went back at sunset into their wicked city. Then our warriors came down from their hill, and after taking many ornaments of yellow metal from the bodies of those they had slain, they marched back out of the valley. Nor have any of us ever returned. They are wicked people, neither white like you nor black like me, but covered with hair as is Bolgani the gorilla. Yes, they are very bad people indeed, and Chawambi was glad to get out of their country. And are none of those alive who were with Chawambi and saw these strange people in their wonderful city? Asked Tarzan. Waziri, our chief, was there, replied Busuli. He was a very young man then, but he accompanied Chawambi, who was his father. So that night Tarzan asked Waziri about it, and Waziri, who was now an old man, said that it was a long march, but that the way was not difficult to follow. He remembered it well. And for 10 days we followed this river, which runs beside our village. Up toward its source we travelled until on the 10th day we came to a little spring far up upon the side of a lofty mountain range. In this little spring our river is born. The next day we crossed over the top of the mountain, and upon the other side we came to a tiny rivulet, which we followed down into a great forest. For many days we travelled along the winding banks of the rivulet that had now become a river, until we came to a greater river, into which it emptied, and which ran down the centre of a mighty valley. Then we followed this large river toward its source, hoping to come to more open land. After 20 days of marching from the time we had crossed the mountains and passed out of our own country, we came again to another range of mountains. Up their side we followed the great river, that had now dwindled to a tiny rivulet, until we came to a little cave near the mountain top. In this cave was the mother of the river. I remember that we camped there that night, and that it was very cold, for the mountains were high. The next day we decided to ascend to the top of the mountains, and see what the country upon the other side looked like. And if it seemed no better than that which we had so far traversed, we would return to our village and tell them that they had already found the best place in all the world to live. And so we clambered up the face of the rocky cliffs until we reached the summit, and there from a flat mountain top we saw, not far beneath us, a shallow valley, very narrow, and upon the far side of it was a great village of stone, much of which had fallen and crumbled into decay. The balance of Waziri's story was practically the same as that which Busuli had told. I should like to go there and see this strange city, said Tarzan, and get some of their yellow metal from its fierce inhabitants. It is a long march, replied Waziri, and I am an old man, but if you will wait until the rainy season is over and the rivers have gone down, I will take some of my warriors and go with you. And Tarzan had to be contented with that arrangement, though he would have liked it well enough to have set off the next morning. He was as impatient as a child. Really, Tarzan of the Apes was but a child, or a primeval man, which is the same thing in a way. The next day, but one, a small party of hunters returned to the village from the south to report a large herd of elephants some miles away. By climbing trees they had had a fairly good view of the herd, which they described as numbering several large tuskers, a great many cows and calves, and full-grown bulls whose ivory would be worth having. The balance of the day and evening was filled with preparation for a great hunt. Spears were overhauled, quivers were replenished, bows were restrung. And all the while the village witch doctor passed through the busy throngs, disposing of various charms and amulets designed to protect the possessor from hurt, or bring him good fortune in the morrow's hunt. At dawn the hunters were off. There were 50 sleek, black warriors, and in their midst, lithe and active as a young forest god, strode Tarzan of the Apes, his brown skin contrasting oddly with the ebony of his companions. Except for color, he was one of them. His ornaments and weapons were the same as theirs. He spoke their language, he laughed and joked with them, and leaped and shouted in the brief wild dance that preceded their departure from the village, to all intent and purpose a savage among savages. Nor, had he questioned himself, is it to be doubted that he would have admitted that he was far more closely allied to these people and their life than to the Parisian friends whose ways, ape-like, he had successfully mimicked for a few short months. But he did think of D'Ernot, and a grin of amusement showed his strong white teeth as he pictured the immaculate Frenchman's expression. Could he by some means see Tarzan as he was that minute? Poor Paul, who had prided himself on having eradicated from his friend the last traces of wild savagery. How quickly have I fallen, thought Tarzan, but in his heart he did not consider it a fall. Rather, he pitied the poor creatures of Paris, penned up like prisoners in their silly clothes and watched by policemen all their poor lives, that they might do nothing that was not entirely artificial and tiresome. A 2 hours' march brought them close to the vicinity in which the elephants had been seen the previous day. From there on they moved very quietly indeed, searching for the spoor of the great beasts. At length they found the well-marked trail along which the herd had passed not many hours before. In single file they followed it for about half an hour. It was Tarzan who first raised his hand in signal that the quarry was at hand. His sensitive nose had warned him that the elephants were not far ahead of them. The blacks were skeptical when he told them how he knew. "Come with me," said Tarzan, "and we shall see." With the agility of a squirrel he sprang into a tree and ran nimbly to the top. One of the blacks followed more slowly and carefully. When he had reached a lofty limb beside the ape-man, the latter pointed to the south, and there, some few hundred yards away, the black saw a number of huge black backs swaying back and forth above the top of the lofty jungle grasses. He pointed the direction to the watchers below, indicating with his fingers the number of beasts he could count. Immediately the hunters started toward the elephants. The black in the tree hastened down, but Tarzan stalked, after his own fashion, along the leafy way of the middle terrace. It is no child's play to hunt wild elephants with the crude weapons of primitive man. Tarzan knew that few native tribes ever attempted it, and the fact that his tribe did so gave him no little pride. Already he was commencing to think of himself as a member of the little community. As Tarzan moved silently through the trees, he saw the warriors below creeping in a half circle upon the still unsuspecting elephants. Finally they were within sight of the great beasts. Now they singled out 2 large tuskers, and at a signal the 50 men rose from the ground where they had lain concealed, and hurled their heavy war spears at the 2 marked beasts. There was not a single miss. 25 spears were embedded in the sides of each of the giant animals. One never moved from the spot where it stood when the avalanche of spears struck it, for 2, perfectly aimed, had penetrated its heart, and it lunged forward upon its knees, rolling to the ground without a struggle. The other, standing nearly head-on toward the hunters, had not proved so good a mark, and though every spear struck, not one entered the great heart. For a moment the huge bull stood trumpeting in rage and pain, casting about with its little eyes for the author of its hurt. The blacks had faded into the jungle before the weak eyes of the monster had fallen upon any of them, but now he caught the sound of their retreat, and amid a terrific crashing of underbrush and branches, he charged in the direction of the noise. It so happened that chance sent him in the direction of Busuli, whom he was overtaking so rapidly that it was as though the black were standing still instead of racing at full speed to escape the certain death which pursued him. Tarzan had witnessed the entire performance from the branches of a nearby tree, and now that he saw his friend's peril, he raced toward the infuriated beast with loud cries, hoping to distract him. But it had been as well had he saved his breath, for the brute was deaf and blind to all else save the particular object of his rage that raced futilely before him. And now Tarzan saw that only a miracle could save Busuli, and with the same unconcern with which he had once hunted this very man, he hurled himself into the path of the elephant to save the black warrior's life. He still grasped his spear, and while Tantor was yet 6 or 8 paces behind his prey, a sinewy white warrior dropped as from the heavens, almost directly in his path. With a vicious lunge the elephant swerved to the right to dispose of this temerarious foeman who dared intervene between himself and his intended victim. But he had not reckoned on the lightning quickness that could galvanize those steel muscles into action so marvelously swift as to baffle even a keener eyesight than Tantor's. And so it happened that before the elephant realized that his new enemy had leaped from his path, Tarzan had driven his iron-shod spear from behind the massive shoulder straight into the fierce heart, and the colossal pachyderm had toppled to his death at the feet of the ape-man. Busuli had not beheld the manner of his deliverance, but Waziri the old chief had seen, and several of the other warriors, and they hailed Tarzan with delight as they swarmed about him and his great kill. When he leaped upon the mighty carcass and gave voice to the weird challenge with which he announced a great victory, the blacks shrank back in fear, for to them it marked the brutal Bolgani, whom they feared fully as much as they feared Numa the lion, but with a fear with which was mixed a certain uncanny awe of the man-like thing to which they attributed supernatural powers. But when Tarzan lowered his raised head and smiled upon them, they were reassured, though they did not understand. Nor did they ever fully understand this strange creature who ran through the trees as quickly as Manu, yet was even more at home upon the ground than themselves, who was except as to colour like unto themselves, yet as powerful as 10 of them, and single-handed a match for the fiercest denizens of the fierce jungle. When the remainder of the warriors had gathered, the hunt was again taken up and the stalking of the retreating herd once more begun, but they had covered a bare 100 yards when, from behind them, at a great distance, sounded faintly a strange popping. For an instant they stood like a group of statuary, intently listening. Then Tarzan spoke. Guns, he said. The village is being attacked. Come, cried Waziri. The Arab raiders have returned with their cannibal slaves for our ivory and our women. Chapter 16: The Ivory Raiders. Waziri's warriors marched at a rapid trot through the jungle in the direction of the village. For a few minutes the sharp cracking of guns ahead warned them to haste, but finally the reports dwindled to an occasional shot, presently ceasing altogether. Nor was this less ominous than the rattle of musketry, for it suggested but a single solution to the little band of rescuers that the illy garrisoned village had already succumbed to the onslaught of a superior force. The returning hunters had covered a little more than 3 miles of the 5 that had separated them from the village when they met the first of the fugitives who had escaped the bullets and clutches of the foe. There were a dozen women, youths, and girls in the party, and so excited were they that they could scarce make themselves understood as they tried to relate to Waziri the calamity that had befallen his people. "They are as many as the leaves of the forest," cried one of the women, in attempting to explain the enemy's force. "There are many Arabs and countless Menuema, and they all have guns. They crept close to the village before we knew that they were about, and then with many shouts they rushed in upon us, shooting down men and women and children, those of us who could fled in all directions into the jungle. But more were killed. I do not know whether they took any prisoners or not. They seemed only bent upon killing us all. The Menuema called us many names, saying that they would eat us all before they left our country, that this was our punishment for killing their friends last year. I did not hear much, for I ran away quickly." The march toward the village was now resumed, more slowly and with greater stealth, for Waziri knew that it was too late to rescue. Their only mission could be one of revenge. Inside the next mile 100 more fugitives were met. There were many men among these, and so the fighting strength of the party was augmented. Now a dozen warriors were sent creeping ahead to reconnoiter. Waziri remained with the main body, which advanced in a thin line that spread in a great crescent through the forest. By the chief's side walked Tarzan. Presently one of the scouts returned. He had come within sight of the village. "They are all within the palisade," he whispered. "Good," said Waziri. "We shall rush in upon them and slay them all." And he made ready to send word along the line that they were to halt at the edge of the clearing until they saw him rush toward the village, then all were to follow. "Wait," cautioned Tarzan. "If there are even 50 guns within the palisade, we shall be repulsed and slaughtered. Let me go alone through the trees, so that I may look down upon them from above and see just how many there be, and what chance we might have were we to charge. It were foolish to lose a single man needlessly if there be no hope of success. I have an idea that we can accomplish more by cunning than by force. Will you wait, Waziri?" "Yes," said the old chief. "Go." So Tarzan sprang into the trees and disappeared in the direction of the village. He moved more cautiously than was his wont, for he knew that men with guns could reach him quite as easily in the treetops as on the ground. And when Tarzan of the Apes elected to adopt stealth, no creature in all the jungle could move so silently or so completely efface himself from the sight of an enemy. In 5 minutes he had wormed his way to the great tree that overhung the palisade at one end of the village, and from his point of vantage looked down upon the savage horde beneath. He counted 50 Arabs and estimated that there were 5 times as many Menuema. The latter were gorging themselves upon food and, under the very noses of their white masters, preparing the gruesome feast which is the piece de resistance that follows a victory in which the bodies of their slain enemies fall into their horrid hands. The ape-man saw that to charge that wild horde, armed as they were with guns and barricaded behind the locked gates of the village, would be a futile task, and so he returned to Waziri and advised him to wait, that he, Tarzan, had a better plan. But a moment before one of the fugitives had related to Waziri the story of the atrocious murder of the old chief's wife, and so crazed with rage was the old man that he cast discretion to the winds. Calling his warriors about him, he commanded them to charge, and with brandishing spears and savage yells, the little force of scarcely more than 100 dashed madly toward the village gates. Before the clearing had been half crossed, the Arabs opened up a withering fire from behind the palisade. With the first volley Waziri fell. The speed of the chargers slackened. Another volley brought down a half-dozen more. A few reached the barred gates, only to be shot in their tracks, without the ghost of a chance to gain the inside of the palisade, and then the whole attack crumpled, and the remaining warriors scampered back into the forest. As they ran, the raiders opened the gates, rushing after them, to complete the day's work with the utter extermination of the tribe. Tarzan had been among the last to turn back toward the forest, and now, as he ran slowly, he turned from time to time to speed a well-aimed arrow into the body of a pursuer. Once within the jungle, he found a little knot of determined blacks waiting to give battle to the oncoming horde, but Tarzan cried to them to scatter, keeping out of harm's way until they could gather in force after dark. "Do as I tell you," he urged, "and I will lead you to victory over these enemies of yours. Scatter through the forest, picking up as many stragglers as you can find, and at night, if you think that you have been followed, come by roundabout ways to the spot where we killed the elephants today. Then I will explain my plan, and you will find that it is good. You cannot hope to pit your puny strength and simple weapons against the numbers and the guns of the Arabs and the Manyuema." They finally assented. "When you scatter," explained Tarzan, "in conclusion, your foes will have to scatter to follow you, and so it may happen that if you are watchful, you can drop many a Manyuema with your arrows from behind some great trees." They had barely time to hasten away farther into the forest before the first of the raiders had crossed the clearing and entered it in pursuit of them. Tarzan ran a short distance along the ground before he took to the trees. Then he raced quickly to the upper terrace, there doubling on his tracks and making his way rapidly back toward the village. Here he found that every Arab and Manyuema had joined in the pursuit, leaving the village deserted except for the chained prisoners and a single guard. The sentry stood at the open gate, looking in the direction of the forest so that he did not see the agile giant that dropped to the ground at the far end of the village street. With drawn bow, the ape-man crept stealthily toward his unsuspecting victim. The prisoners had already discovered him, and with wide eyes filled with wonder and with hope they watched their would-be rescuer. Now he halted not 10 paces from the unconscious Manyuema. The shaft was drawn back its full length at the height of the keen grey eye that sighted along its polished surface. There was a sudden twang as the brown fingers released their hold, and without a sound the raider sank forward upon his face, a wooden shaft transfixing his heart and protruding a foot from his black chest. Then Tarzan turned his attention to the 50 women and youths chained neck to neck on the long slave chain. There was no releasing of the ancient padlocks in the time that was left him, so the ape-man called to them to follow him as they were, and snatching the gun and cartridge belt from the dead sentry, he led the now happy band out through the village gate and into the forest upon the far side of the clearing. It was a slow and arduous march, for the slave chain was new to these people and there were many delays as one of their number would stumble and fall, dragging others down with her. Then, too, Tarzan had been forced to make a wide detour to avoid any possibility of meeting with returning raiders. He was partially guided by occasional shots which indicated that the Arab horde was still in touch with the villagers, but he knew that if they would but follow his advice there would be but few casualties other than on the side of the marauders. Toward dusk the firing ceased entirely, and Tarzan knew that the Arabs had all returned to the village. He could scarce repress a smile of triumph as he thought of their rage on discovering that their guard had been killed and their prisoners taken away. Tarzan had wished that he might have taken some of the great store of ivory the village contained, solely for the purpose of still further augmenting the wrath of his enemies, but he knew that that was not necessary for its salvation, since he already had a plan mapped out which would effectually prevent the Arabs leaving the country with a single tusk, and it would have been cruel to have needlessly burdened these poor, overwrought women with the extra weight of the heavy ivory. It was after midnight when Tarzan, with his slow-moving caravan, approached the spot where the elephants lay. Long before they reached it, they had been guided by the huge fire the natives had built in the center of a hastily improvised boma, partially for warmth and partially to keep off chance lions. When they had come close to the encampment, Tarzan called aloud to let them know that friends were coming. It was a joyous reception the little party received when the blacks within the boma saw the long file of fettered friends and relatives enter the firelight. These had all been given up as lost forever, as had Tarzan as well, so that the happy blacks would have remained awake all night to feast on elephant meat and celebrate the return of their fellows had not Tarzan insisted that they take what sleep they could against the work of the coming day. At that, sleep was no easy matter, for the women who had lost their men or their children in the day's massacre and battle made night hideous with their continued wailing and howling. Finally, however, Tarzan succeeded in silencing them, on the plea that their noise would attract the Arabs to their hiding place, when all would be slaughtered. When dawn came, Tarzan explained his plan of battle to the warriors, and without demur one and all agreed that it was the safest and surest way in which to rid themselves of their unwelcome visitors and be revenged for the murder of their fellows. First, the women and children, with a guard of some 20 old warriors and youths, were started southward, to be entirely out of the zone of danger. They had instructions to erect temporary shelter and construct a protecting boma of thorn bush, for the plan of campaign which Tarzan had chosen was one which might stretch out over many days, or even weeks, during which time the warriors would not return to the new camp. 2 hours after daylight, a thin circle of black warriors surrounded the village. At intervals, one was perched high in the branches of a tree which could overlook the palisade. Presently a Manyuema within the village fell, pierced by a single arrow. There had been no sound of attack, none of the hideous war cries or vainglorious waving of menacing spears that ordinarily marks the attack of savages, just a silent messenger of death from out of the silent forest. The Arabs and their followers were thrown into a fine rage at this unprecedented occurrence. They ran for the gates to wreak dire vengeance upon the foolhardy perpetrator of the outrage, but they suddenly realized that they did not know which way to turn to find the foe. As they stood debating with many angry shouts and much gesticulating, one of the Arabs sank silently to the ground, in their very midst a thin arrow protruding from his heart. Tarzan had placed the finest marksmen of the tribe in the surrounding trees, with directions never to reveal themselves while the enemy was faced in their direction. As a black released his messenger of death, he would slink behind the sheltering stem of the tree he had selected, nor would he again aim until a watchful eye told him that none was looking toward his tree. 3 times the Arabs started across the clearing in the direction from which they thought the arrows came, but each time another arrow would come from behind to take its toll from among their number. Then they would turn and charge in a new direction. Finally they set out upon a determined search of the forest, but the blacks melted before them, so that they saw no sign of an enemy. But above them lurked a grim figure in the dense foliage of the mighty trees. It was Tarzan of the apes, hovering over them as if he had been the shadow of death. Presently a Manyuema forged ahead of his companions. There was none to see from what direction death came, and so it came quickly, and a moment later those behind stumbled over the dead body of their comrade, the inevitable arrow piercing the still heart. It does not take a great deal of this manner of warfare to get upon the nerves of white men, and so it is little to be wondered at that the Manyuema were soon panic-stricken. Did one forge ahead, an arrow found his heart. Did one lag behind, he never again was seen alive. Did one stumble to one side, even for a bare moment from the sight of his fellows, he did not return, and always when they came upon the bodies of their dead, they found those terrible arrows driven with the accuracy of superhuman power straight through the victim's heart. But worse than all else was the hideous fact that not once during the morning had they seen or heard the slightest sign of an enemy other than the pitiless arrows. When finally they returned to the village, it was no better. Every now and then, at varying intervals that were maddening in the terrible suspense they caused, a man would plunge forward dead. The blacks besought their masters to leave this terrible place, but the Arabs feared to take up the march through the grim and hostile forest beset by this new and terrible enemy, while laden with the great store of ivory they had found within the village. But, worse yet, they hated to leave the ivory behind. Finally, the entire expedition took refuge within the thatched huts. Here, at least, they would be free from the arrows. Tarzan, from the tree above the village, had marked the hut into which the chief Arabs had gone, and balancing himself upon an overhanging limb, he drove his heavy spear with all the force of his giant muscles through the thatched roof. A howl of pain told him that it had found a mark. With this parting salute to convince them that there was no safety for them anywhere within the country, Tarzan returned to the forest, collected his warriors, and withdrew a mile to the south to rest and eat. He kept sentries in several trees that commanded a view of the trail toward the village, but there was no pursuit. An inspection of his force showed not a single casualty, not even a minor wound, while rough estimates of the enemy's loss convinced the blacks that no fewer than 20 had fallen before their arrows. They were wild with elation, and were for finishing the day in one glorious rush upon the village, during which they would slaughter the last of their foemen. They were even picturing the various tortures they would inflict, and gloating over the suffering of the Manyuema, for whom they entertained a peculiar hatred, when Tarzan put his foot down flatly upon the plan. "You are crazy," he cried. "I have shown you the only way to fight these people. Already you have killed 20 of them without the loss of a single warrior, whereas yesterday, following your own tactics, which you would now renew, you lost at least a dozen, and killed not a single Arab or Manyuema. You will fight just as I tell you to fight, or I shall leave you and go back to my own country." They were frightened when he threatened this, and promised to obey him scrupulously if he would but promise not to desert them. "Very well," he said. "We shall return to the elephant boma for the night. I have a plan to give the Arabs a little taste of what they may expect if they remain in our country, but I shall need no help. Come, if they suffer no more for the balance of the day, they will feel reassured. And the relapse into fear will be even more nerve-wracking than as though we continued to frighten them all afternoon. So they marched back to their camp of the previous night, and lighting great fires, ate and recounted the adventures of the day until long after dark. Tarzan slept until midnight. Then he arose and crept into the Cimmerian blackness of the forest. An hour later he came to the edge of the clearing before the village. There was a campfire burning within the palisade. The ape-man crept across the clearing until he stood before the barred gates. Through the interstices he saw a lone sentry sitting before the fire. Quietly Tarzan went to the tree at the end of the village street. He climbed softly to his place and fitted an arrow to his bow. For several minutes he tried to sight fairly upon the sentry, but the waving branches and flickering firelight convinced him that the danger of a miss was too great. He must touch the heart full in the center to bring the quiet and sudden death his plan required. He had brought, besides his bow, arrows, and rope, the gun he had taken the previous day from the other sentry he had killed. Caching all these in a convenient crotch of the tree, he dropped lightly to the ground within the palisade, armed only with his long knife. The sentry's back was toward him. Like a cat, Tarzan crept upon the dozing man. He was within 2 paces of him now. Another instant, and the knife would slide silently into the fellow's heart. Tarzan crouched for a spring, for that is ever the quickest and surest attack of the jungle beast, when the man, warned by some subtle sense, sprang to his feet and faced the ape-man. Chapter 17. The White Chief of the Waziri. When the eyes of the black Manyuema savage fell upon the strange apparition that confronted him with menacing knife, they went wide in horror. He forgot the gun within his hands. He even forgot to cry out. His one thought was to escape this fearsome-looking white savage, this giant of a man upon whose massive rolling muscles and mighty chest the flickering firelight played. But before he could turn, Tarzan was upon him, and then the sentry thought to scream for aid, but it was too late. A great hand was upon his windpipe, and he was being borne to the earth. He battled furiously but futilely with the grim tenacity of a bulldog. Those awful fingers were clinging to his throat. Swiftly and surely life was being choked from him. His eyes bulged, his tongue protruded, his face turned to a ghastly purplish hue. There was a convulsive tremor of the stiffening muscles, and the Manyuema sentry lay quite still. The ape-man threw the body across one of his broad shoulders and, gathering up the fellow's gun, trotted silently up the sleeping village street toward the tree that gave him such easy ingress to the palisaded village. He bore the dead sentry into the midst of the leafy maze above. First he stripped the body of cartridge belt and such ornaments as he craved, wedging it into a convenient crotch while his nimble fingers ran over it in search of the loot he could not plainly see in the dark. When he had finished, he took the gun that had belonged to the man and walked far out upon a limb, from the end of which he could obtain a better view of the huts. Drawing a careful bead on the beehive structure in which he knew the chief Arabs to be, he pulled the trigger. Almost instantly there was an answering groan. Tarzan smiled. He had made another lucky hit. Following the shot there was a moment's silence in the camp, and then Manyuema and Arab came pouring from the huts like a swarm of angry hornets, but, if the truth were known, they were even more frightened than they were angry. The strain of the preceding day had wrought upon the fears of both black and white, and now this single shot in the night conjured all manner of terrible conjectures in their terrified minds. When they discovered that their sentry had disappeared, their fears were in no way allayed, and as though to bolster their courage by warlike actions, they began to fire rapidly at the barred gates of the village, although no enemy was in sight. Tarzan took advantage of the deafening roar of this fusillade to fire into the mob beneath him. No one heard his shot above the din of rattling musketry in the street, but some who were standing close saw one of their number crumple suddenly to the earth. When they leaned over him, he was dead. They were panic-stricken, and it took all the brutal authority of the Arabs to keep the Manyuema from rushing helter-skelter into the jungle anywhere to escape from this terrible village. After a time they commenced to quiet down, and as no further mysterious deaths occurred among them, they took heart again. But it was a short-lived respite, for just as they had concluded that they would not be disturbed again, Tarzan gave voice to a weird moan, and as the raiders looked up in the direction from which the sound seemed to come, the ape-man, who stood swinging the dead body of the sentry gently to and fro, suddenly shot the corpse far out above their heads. With howls of alarm the throng broke in all directions to escape this new and terrible creature who seemed to be springing upon them. To their fear-distorted imaginations, the body of the sentry, falling with wide-sprawled arms and legs, assumed the likeness of a great beast of prey. In their anxiety to escape, many of the blacks scaled the palisade, while others tore down the bars from the gates and rushed madly across the clearing toward the jungle. For a time no one turned back toward the thing that had frightened them, but Tarzan knew that they would in a moment, and when they discovered that it was but the dead body of their sentry, while they would doubtless be still further terrified, he had a rather definite idea as to what they would do. And so he faded silently away toward the south, taking the moonlit upper terrace back toward the camp of the Waziri. Presently one of the Arabs turned and saw that the thing that had leaped from the tree upon them lay still and quiet where it had fallen in the center of the village street. Cautiously he crept back toward it until he saw that it was but a man. A moment later he was beside the figure, and in another had recognized it as the corpse of the Menuema who had stood on guard at the village gate. His companions rapidly gathered around at his call, and after a moment's excited conversation they did precisely what Tarzan had reasoned they would. Raising their guns to their shoulders, they poured volley after volley into the tree from which the corpse had been thrown. Had Tarzan remained there, he would have been riddled by 100 bullets. When the Arabs and Menuema discovered that the only marks of violence upon the body of their dead comrade were giant fingerprints upon his swollen throat, they were again thrown into deeper apprehension and despair. That they were not even safe within a palisaded village at night came as a distinct shock to them. That an enemy could enter into the midst of their camp and kill their sentry with bare hands seemed outside the bounds of reason, and so the superstitious Menuema commenced to attribute their ill luck to supernatural causes, nor were the Arabs able to offer any better explanation. With at least 50 of their number flying through the black jungle, and without the slightest knowledge of when their uncanny foemen might resume the cold-blooded slaughter they had commenced, it was a desperate band of cutthroats that waited sleeplessly for the dawn. But only on the promise of the Arabs that they would leave the village at daybreak and hasten onward toward their own land would the remaining Menuema consent to stay at the village a moment longer. Not even fear of their cruel masters was sufficient to overcome this new terror. And so it was that when Tarzan and his warriors returned to the attack the next morning, they found the raiders prepared to march out of the village. The Menuema were laden with stolen ivory. As Tarzan saw it, he grinned, for he knew that they would not carry it far. Then he saw something which caused him anxiety. A number of the Menuema were lighting torches in the remnant of the campfire. They were about to fire the village. Tarzan was perched in a tall tree some 100 yards from the palisade. Making a trumpet of his hands, he called loudly in the Arab tongue, "Do not fire the huts, or we shall kill you all. Do not fire the huts, or we shall kill you all. Do not fire the huts, or we shall kill you all." A dozen times he repeated it. The Menuema hesitated, then one of them flung his torch into the campfire. The others were about to do the same when an Arab sprung upon them with a stick, beating them toward the huts. Tarzan could see that he was commanding them to fire the little thatched dwellings. Then he stood erect upon the swaying branch 100 feet above the ground, and raising one of the Arab guns to his shoulder, took careful aim and fired. With the report, the Arab who was urging on his men to burn the village fell in his tracks, and the Menuema threw away their torches and fled from the village. The last Tarzan saw of them, they were racing toward the jungle, while their former masters knelt upon the ground and fired at them. But however angry the Arabs might have been at the insubordination of their slaves, they were at least convinced that it would be the better part of wisdom to forego the pleasure of firing the village that had given them two such nasty receptions. In their hearts, however, they swore to return again with such force as would enable them to sweep the entire country for miles around, until no vestige of human life remained. They had looked in vain for the owner of the voice which had frightened off the men who had been detailed to put the torch to the huts, but not even the keenest eye among them had been able to locate him. They had seen the puff of smoke from the tree following the shot that brought down the Arab, but, though a volley had immediately been loosed into its foliage, there had been no indication that it had been effective. Tarzan was too intelligent to be caught in any such trap, and so the report of his shot had scarcely died away before the ape-man was on the ground and racing for another tree 100 yards away. Here he again found a suitable perch from which he could watch the preparations of the raiders. It occurred to him that he might have considerable more fun with them, so again he called to them through his improvised trumpet. "Leave the ivory," he cried. "Leave the ivory. Dead men have no use for ivory." Some of the Menuema started to lay down their loads, but this was altogether too much for the avaricious Arabs. With loud shouts and curses they aimed their guns full upon the bearers, threatening instant death to any who might lay down his load. They could give up firing the village, but the thought of abandoning this enormous fortune in ivory was quite beyond their conception. Better death than that. And so they marched out of the village of the Waziri, and on the shoulders of their slaves was the ivory ransom of a score of kings. Toward the north they marched, back toward their savage settlement in the wild and unknown country which lies back from the Congo in the uttermost depths of the great forest, and on either side of them traveled an invisible and relentless foe. Under Tarzan's guidance, the black Waziri warriors stationed themselves along the trail on either side in the densest underbrush. They stood at far intervals, and as the column passed, a single arrow or a heavy spear, well aimed, would pierce a Manyuema or an Arab. Then the Waziri would melt into the distance and run ahead to take his stand farther on. They did not strike unless success were sure and the danger of detection almost nothing, and so the arrows and the spears were few and far between, but so persistent and inevitable that the slow-moving column of heavy-laden raiders was in a constant state of panic at the uncertainty of who the next would be to fall, and when. It was with the greatest difficulty that the Arabs prevented their men a dozen times from throwing away their burdens and fleeing like frightened rabbits up the trail toward the north. And so the day wore on a frightful nightmare of a day for the raiders, a day of weary but well-repaid work for the Waziri. At night, the Arabs constructed a rude boma in a little clearing by a river and went into camp. At intervals during the night, a rifle would bark close above their heads, and one of the dozen sentries which they now had posted would tumble to the ground. Such a condition was insupportable, for they saw that by means of these hideous tactics they would be completely wiped out, one by one, without inflicting a single death upon their enemy. But yet, with the persistent avariciousness of the white man, the Arabs clung to their loot, and when morning came forced the demoralized Manyuema to take up their burdens of death and stagger on into the jungle. For 3 days the withering column kept up its frightful march. Each hour was marked by its deadly arrow or cruel spear. The nights were made hideous by the barking of the invisible gun that made sentry duty equivalent to a death sentence. On the morning of the 4th day the Arabs were compelled to shoot 2 of their blacks before they could compel the balance to take up the hated ivory, and as they did so a voice rang out, clear and strong, from the jungle, "Today you die, O Menuem. Unless you lay down the ivory, fall upon your cruel masters and kill them. You have guns, why do you not use them? Kill the Arabs, and we will not harm you. We will take you back to our village and feed you, and lead you out of our country in safety and in peace. Lay down the ivory, and fall upon your masters, we will help you. Else you die." As the voice died down, the raiders stood as though turned to stone. The Arabs eyed their Menuema slaves. The slaves looked first at one of their fellows, and then at another. They were but waiting for someone to take the initiative. There were some 30 Arabs left, and about 150 blacks. All were armed, even those who were acting as porters had their rifles slung across their backs. And the Arabs drew together. The sheikh ordered the Menuema to take up the march, and as he spoke he cocked his rifle and raised it, but at the same instant one of the blacks threw down his load, and snatching his rifle from his back, fired point blank at the group of Arabs. In an instant the camp was a cursing, howling mass of demons fighting with guns and knives and pistols. The Arabs stood together and defended their lives valiantly, but with the rain of lead that poured upon them from their own slaves, and the shower of arrows and spears which now leaped from the surrounding jungle, aimed solely at them. There was little question from the first what the outcome would be. In 10 minutes from the time the first porter had thrown down his load, the last of the Arabs lay dead. When the firing had ceased, Tarzan spoke again to the Menuema. "Take up our ivory and return it to our village, from whence you stole it. We shall not harm you." For a moment the Menuema hesitated. They had no stomach to retrace that difficult 3 days' trail. They talked together in low whispers, and one turned toward the jungle, calling aloud to the voice that had spoken to them from out of the foliage. "How do we know that when you have us in your village you will not kill us all?" he asked. "You do not know," replied Tarzan, "other than that we have promised not to harm you if you will return our ivory to us. But this you do know, that it lies within our power to kill you all if you do not return as we direct, and are we not more likely to do so if you anger us than if you do as we bid?" "Who are you that speaks the tongue of our Arab masters?" cried the Menuema spokesman. "Let us see you, and then we shall give you our answer." Tarzan stepped out of the jungle a dozen paces from them. "Look," he said. When they saw that he was white they were filled with awe, for never had they seen a white savage before, and at his great muscles and giant frame they were struck with wonder and admiration. "You may trust me," said Tarzan. "So long as you do as I tell you and harm none of my people, we shall do you no hurt. Will you take up our ivory and return in peace to our village, or shall we follow along your trail toward the north as we have followed for the past 3 days?" The recollection of the horrid days that had just passed was the thing that finally decided the Manyuema, and so after a short conference they took up their burdens and set off to retrace their steps toward the village of the Waziri. At the end of the 3rd day they marched into the village gate, and were greeted by the survivors of the recent massacre, to whom Tarzan had sent a messenger in their temporary camp to the south on the day that the raiders had quitted the village, telling them that they might return in safety. It took all the mastery and persuasion that Tarzan possessed to prevent the Waziri falling on the Manyuema tooth and nail and tearing them to pieces. But when he had explained that he had given his word that they would not be molested if they carried the ivory back to the spot from which they had stolen it, and had further impressed upon his people that they owed their entire victory to him, they finally acceded to his demands, and allowed the cannibals to rest in peace within their palisade. That night, the village warriors held a big palaver to celebrate their victories and to choose a new chief. Since old Waziri's death, Tarzan had been directing the warriors in battle, and the temporary command had been tacitly conceded to him. There had been no time to choose a new chief from among their own number, and in fact so remarkably successful had they been under the ape-man's generalship that they had had no wish to delegate the supreme authority to another for fear that what they already had gained might be lost. They had so recently seen the results of running counter to this savage white man's advice in the disastrous charge ordered by Waziri, in which he himself had died, that it had not been difficult for them to accept Tarzan's authority as final. The principal warriors sat in a circle about a small fire to discuss the relative merits of whomever might be suggested as old Waziri's successor. It was Busuli who spoke first. "Since Waziri is dead, leaving no son, there is but one among us whom we know from experience is fitted to make us a good king. There is only one who has proved that he can successfully lead us against the guns of the white man, and bring us easy victory without the loss of a single life. There is only one, and that is the white man who has led us for the past few days." And Busuli sprang to his feet, and with uplifted spear and half-bent, crouching body commenced to dance slowly about Tarzan, chanting in time to his steps, "Waziri, king of the Waziri, Waziri, killer of Arabs, Waziri, king of the Waziri, king of the Waziri." One by one the other warriors signified their acceptance of Tarzan as their king by joining in the solemn dance. The women came and squatted about the rim of the circle, beating upon tom-toms, clapping their hands in time to the steps of the dancers, and joining in the chant of the warriors. In the center of the circle sat Tarzan of the Apes, Waziri, king of the Waziri, for like his predecessor he was to take the name of his tribe as his own. Faster and faster grew the pace of the dancers, louder and louder their wild and savage shouts. The women rose and fell in unison, shrieking now at the tops of their voices. The spears were brandishing fiercely, and as the dancers stooped down and beat their shields upon the hard tramped earth of the village street, the whole sight was as terribly primeval and savage as though it were being staged in the dim dawn of humanity, countless ages in the past. As the excitement waxed, the ape-man sprang to his feet and joined in the wild ceremony. In the center of the circle of glittering black bodies he leaped and roared and shook his heavy spear in the same mad abandon that enthralled his fellow savages. The last remnant of his civilization was forgotten. He was a primitive man to the fullest, now reveling in the freedom of the fierce wild life he loved, gloating in his kingship among these wild blacks. Ah, if Olga de Coude had but seen him then, could she have recognized the well-dressed, quiet young man whose well-bred face and irreproachable manners had so captivated her but a few short months ago? And Jane Porter. Would she have still loved this savage warrior chieftain, dancing naked among his naked savage subjects? And Diana not? Could Diana not have believed that this was the same man he had introduced into half a dozen of the most select clubs of Paris? What would his fellow peers in the House of Lords have said had one pointed to this dancing giant, with his barbaric headdress and his metal ornaments, and said, "There, my lords, is John Clayton, Lord Greystoke"? And so Tarzan of the Apes came into a real kingship among men. Slowly but surely was he following the evolution of his ancestors, for had he not started at the very bottom? Chapter 18: The Lottery of Death. Jane Porter had been the first of those in the lifeboat to awaken the morning after the wreck of the Lady Alice. The other members of the party were asleep upon the thwarts or huddled in cramped positions in the bottom of the boat. When the girl realized that they had become separated from the other boats, she was filled with alarm. The sense of utter loneliness and helplessness which the vast expanse of deserted ocean aroused in her was so depressing that, from the first, contemplation of the future held not the slightest ray of promise for her. She was confident that they were lost beyond possibility of succor. Presently Clayton awoke. It was several minutes before he could gather his senses sufficiently to realize where he was or recall the disaster of the previous night. Finally his bewildered eyes fell upon the girl. "Jane," he cried. "Thank God that we are together." "Look," said the girl dully, indicating the horizon with an apathetic gesture. "We are all alone." Clayton scanned the water in every direction. "Where can they be?" he cried. "They cannot have gone down, for there has been no sea, and they were afloat after the yacht sank. I saw them all." He awoke the other members of the party and explained their plight. "It is just as well that the boats are scattered," said one of the sailors. "They are all provisioned, so that they do not need each other on that score, and should a storm blow up they could be of no service to one another even if they were together, but scattered about the ocean there is a much better chance that one at least will be picked up. And then a search will be at once started for the others. Were we together there would be but one chance of rescue, where now there may be four." They saw the wisdom of his philosophy and were cheered by it, but their joy was short-lived, for when it was decided that they should row steadily toward the east and the continent, it was discovered that the sailors who had been at the only 2 oars with which the boat had been provided had fallen asleep at their work and allowed both to slip into the sea, nor were they in sight anywhere upon the water. During the angry words and recriminations which followed, the sailors nearly came to blows, but Clayton succeeded in quieting them, though a moment later Monsieur Tarzan almost precipitated another row by making a nasty remark about the stupidity of all Englishmen, and especially English sailors. "Come, come, mates," spoke up one of the men, Tompkins, who had taken no part in the altercation. "Shooting off our bloomin' mugs won't get us nothin'. As Spider has said afore, we'll all bloody well be picked up anyway," says he, "so what's the use o' squabblin'? Let's eat," says I. "That's not a bad idea," said Monsieur Tarzan, and then turning to the third sailor, Wilson, he said, "Pass one of those tins aft, my good man." "Fetch it yourself," retorted Wilson sullenly. "I ain't a-takin' no orders from no furriner. You ain't captain o' this ship yet." The result was that Clayton himself had to get the tin, and then another angry altercation ensued when one of the sailors accused Clayton and Monsieur Tarzan of conspiring to control the provisions so that they could have the lion's share. "Someone should take command of this boat," spoke up Jane Porter, thoroughly disgusted with the disgraceful wrangling that had marked the very opening of a forced companionship that might last for many days. "It is terrible enough to be alone in a frail boat on the Atlantic, without having the added misery and danger of constant bickering and brawling among the members of our party. You men should elect a leader, and then abide by his decisions in all matters. There is greater need for strict discipline here than there is upon a well-ordered ship." She had hoped before she voiced her sentiments that it would not be necessary for her to enter into the transaction at all, for she believed that Clayton was amply able to cope with every emergency. But she had to admit that so far at least he had shown no greater promise of successfully handling the situation than any of the others, though he had at least refrained from adding in any way to the unpleasantness, even going so far as to give up the tin to the sailors when they objected to its being opened by him. The girl's words temporarily quieted the men, and finally it was decided that the 2 kegs of water and the 4 tins of food should be divided into 2 parts, one half going forward to the 3 sailors to do with as they saw best, and the balance aft to the 3 passengers. Thus was the little company divided into 2 camps, and when the provisions had been apportioned, each immediately set to work to open and distribute food and water. The sailors were the first to get one of the tins of food open, and their curses of rage and disappointment caused Clayton to ask what the trouble might be. "Trouble," shrieked Spider. "Trouble. It's worse than trouble, it's death. This tin is full of coal oil." Hastily now Clayton and Monsieur Tarzan tore open one of theirs, only to learn the hideous truth that it also contained not food but coal oil. One after another the 4 tins on board were opened, and as the contents of each became known, howls of anger announced the grim truth: there was not an ounce of food upon the boat. "Well, thank God it wasn't the water," cried Tompkins. "It's easier to get along without food than it is without water. We can eat our shoes if worse comes to worse, but we couldn't drink 'em." As he spoke, Wilson had been boring a hole in one of the water kegs, and as Spider held a tin cup, he tilted the keg to pour a draught of the precious fluid. A thin stream of blackish, dry particles filtered slowly through the tiny aperture into the bottom of the cup. With a groan, Wilson dropped the keg and sat staring at the dry stuff in the cup, speechless with horror. "The kegs are filled with gunpowder," said Spider in a low tone, turning to those aft, and so it proved when the last had been opened. "Coal, oil, and gunpowder," cried Monsieur Tarzan. "Sapristi, what a diet for shipwrecked mariners!" With the full knowledge that there was neither food nor water on board, the pangs of hunger and thirst became immediately aggravated, and so on the first day of their tragic adventure real suffering commenced in grim earnest, and the full horrors of shipwreck were upon them. As the days passed, conditions became horrible. Aching eyes scanned the horizon day and night until the weak and weary watchers would sink exhausted to the bottom of the boat, and their rest in dream-disturbed slumber a moment's respite from the horrors of the waking reality. The sailors, goaded by the remorseless pangs of hunger, had eaten their leather belts, their shoes, the sweatbands from their caps, although both Clayton and Monsieur Tarzan had done their best to convince them that these would only add to the suffering they were enduring. Weak and hopeless, the entire party lay beneath the pitiless tropic sun, with parched lips and swollen tongues, waiting for the death they were beginning to crave. The intense suffering of the first few days had become deadened for the 3 passengers who had eaten nothing, but the agony of the sailors was pitiful, as their weak and impoverished stomachs attempted to cope with the bits of leather with which they had filled them. Tompkins was the first to succumb. Just a week from the day the Lady Alice went down, the sailor died horribly in frightful convulsions. For hours his contorted and hideous features lay grinning back at those in the stern of the little boat, until Jane Porter could endure the sight no longer. "Can you not drop his body overboard, William?" she asked. Clayton rose and staggered toward the corpse. The 2 remaining sailors eyed him with a strange, baleful light in their sunken orbs. Futilely the Englishman tried to lift the corpse over the side of the boat, but his strength was not equal to the task. "Lend me a hand here, please," he said to Wilson, who lay nearest him. "What, do you want to throw him over for?" questioned the sailor in a querulous voice. "We've got to before we're too weak to do it," replied Clayton. "He'd be awful by tomorrow, after a day under that broiling sun." "Better leave well enough alone," grumbled Wilson. "We may need him before tomorrow." Slowly the meaning of the man's words percolated into Clayton's understanding. At last he realized the fellow's reason for objecting to the disposal of the dead man. "God," whispered Clayton, in a horrified tone. "You don't mean—" "Why not?" growled Wilson. "Ain't we gotta live? He's dead," he added, jerking his thumb in the direction of the corpse. "He won't care." "Come here," Tarzan said Clayton, turning toward the Russian. "We'll have something worse than death aboard us if we don't get rid of this body before dark." Wilson staggered up menacingly to prevent the contemplated act, but when his comrade Spider took sides with Clayton and Monsieur Tarzan, he gave up and sat eyeing the corpse hungrily as the 3 men, by combining their efforts, succeeded in rolling it overboard. All the balance of the day Wilson sat glaring at Clayton, in his eyes the gleam of insanity. Toward evening, as the sun was sinking into the sea, he commenced to chuckle and mumble to himself, but his eyes never left Clayton. After it became quite dark, Clayton could still feel those terrible eyes upon him. He dared not sleep, and yet so exhausted was he that it was a constant fight to retain consciousness. After what seemed an eternity of suffering, his head dropped upon a thwart, and he slept. How long he was unconscious he did not know. He was awakened by a shuffling noise quite close to him. The moon had risen, and as he opened his startled eyes he saw Wilson creeping stealthily toward him, his mouth open and his swollen tongue hanging out. The slight noise had awakened Jane Porter at the same time, and as she saw the hideous tableau she gave a shrill cry of alarm, and at the same instant the sailor lurched forward and fell upon Clayton. Like a wild beast his teeth sought the throat of his intended prey, but Clayton, weak though he was, still found sufficient strength to hold the maniac's mouth from him. At Jane Porter's scream, Monsieur Tarzan and Spider awoke. On seeing the cause of her alarm, both men crawled to Clayton's rescue, and between the 3 of them were able to subdue Wilson and hurl him to the bottom of the boat. For a few minutes he lay there, chattering and laughing, and then, with an awful scream, and before any of his companions could prevent, he staggered to his feet and leaped overboard. The reaction from the terrific strain of excitement left the weak survivors trembling and prostrated. Spider broke down and wept. Jane Porter prayed. Clayton swore softly to himself. Monsieur Tarzan sat with his head in his hands, thinking. The result of his cogitation developed the following morning in a proposition he made to Spider and Clayton. "Gentlemen," said Monsieur Tarzan, "you see the fate that awaits us all unless we are picked up within a day or two. That there is little hope of that is evidenced by the fact that during all the days we have drifted we have seen no sail, nor the faintest smudge of smoke upon the horizon. There might be a chance if we had food, but without food there is none. There remains for us, then, but one of two alternatives, and we must choose at once. Either we must all die together within a few days, or one must be sacrificed that the others may live. Do you quite clearly grasp my meaning?" Jane Porter, who had overheard, was horrified. If the proposition had come from the poor, ignorant sailor, she might possibly have not been so surprised, but that it should come from one who posed as a man of culture and refinement, from a gentleman, she could scarcely credit. "It is better that we die together," then said Clayton. "That is for the majority to decide," replied Monsieur Tarzan. "As only one of us three will be the object of sacrifice, we shall decide. Miss Porter is not interested, since she will be in no danger." "How shall we know who is to be first?" asked Spider. "It may be fairly fixed by lot," replied Monsieur Tarzan. "I have a number of franc pieces in my pocket. We can choose a certain date from among them. The one to draw this date first from beneath a piece of cloth will be the first." "I shall have nothing to do with any such diabolical plan," muttered Clayton. "Even yet land may be sighted, or a ship appear in time." "You will do as the majority decide, or you will be the first without the formality of drawing lots," said Monsieur Tarzan threateningly. "Come, let us vote on the plan. I for 1 a.m. in favor of it. How about you, Spider?" "And I," replied the sailor. "It is the will of the majority," announced Monsieur Tarzan, "and now let us lose no time in drawing lots. It is as fair for one as for another. That 3 may live, one of us must die perhaps a few hours sooner than otherwise." Then he began his preparation for the lottery of death, while Jane Porter sat wide-eyed and horrified at thought of the thing that she was about to witness. Monsieur Tarzan spread his coat upon the bottom of the boat, and then from a handful of money he selected 6 franc pieces. The other 2 men bent close above him as he inspected them. Finally he handed them all to Clayton. "Look at them carefully," he said. "The oldest date is 1875, and there is only one of that year." Clayton and the sailor inspected each coin. To them there seemed not the slightest difference that could be detected other than the dates. They were quite satisfied. Had they known that Monsieur Tarzan's past experience as a card sharp had trained his sense of touch to so fine a point that he could almost differentiate between cards by the mere feel of them, they would scarcely have felt that the plan was so entirely fair. The 1875 piece was a hair thinner than the other coins, but neither Clayton nor Spider could have detected it without the aid of a micrometer. "In what order shall we draw?" asked Monsieur Tarzan, knowing from past experience that the majority of men always prefer last chance in a lottery where the single prize is some distasteful thing. There is always the chance and the hope that another will draw it first. Monsieur Tarzan, for reasons of his own, preferred to draw first if the drawing should happen to require a second adventure beneath the coat. And so when Spider elected to draw last, he graciously offered to take the first chance himself. His hand was under the coat for but a moment, yet those quick, deft fingers had felt of each coin, and found and discarded the fatal piece. When he brought forth his hand, it contained an 1888 franc piece. Then Clayton drew. Jane Porter leaned forward with a tense and horrified expression on her face as the hand of the man she was to marry groped about beneath the coat. Presently he withdrew it, a franc piece lying in the palm. For an instant he dared not look, but Monsieur Tarzan, who had leaned nearer to see the date, exclaimed that he was safe. Jane Porter sank weak and trembling against the side of the boat. She felt sick and dizzy, and now, if Spider should not draw the 1875 piece, she must endure the whole horrid thing again. The sailor already had his hand beneath the coat. Great beads of sweat were standing upon his brow. He trembled as though with a fit of ague. Aloud he cursed himself for having taken the last draw, for now his chances for escape were but 3-1, whereas Monsieur Tarzan's had been 5-1, and Clayton's 4-1. The Russian was very patient and did not hurry the man, for he knew that he himself was quite safe whether the 1875 piece came out this time or not. When the sailor withdrew his hand and looked at the piece of money within, he dropped fainting to the bottom of the boat. Both Clayton and Monsieur Tarzan hastened weakly to examine the coin which had rolled from the man's hand and lay beside him. It was not dated 1875. The reaction from the state of fear he had been in had overcome Spider quite as effectually as though he had drawn the fated piece. But now the whole proceeding must be gone through again. Once more the Russian drew forth a harmless coin. Jane Porter closed her eyes as Clayton reached beneath the coat. Spider bent, wide-eyed, toward the hand that was to decide his fate. For whatever luck was Clayton's on this last draw, the opposite would be Spider's. Then William Cecil Clayton, Lord Greystoke, removed his hand from beneath the coat, and with a coin tight pressed within his palm where none might see it, he looked at Jane Porter. He did not dare open his hand. "Quick," hissed Spider. "My God, let's see it." Clayton opened his fingers. Spider was the first to see the date, and ere any knew what his intention was, he raised himself to his feet and lunged over the side of the boat to disappear forever into the green depths beneath the coin had not been the 1875 piece. The strain had exhausted those who remained to such an extent that they lay half unconscious for the balance of the day, nor was the subject referred to again for several days, horrible days of increasing weakness and hopelessness. At length Monsieur Tarzan crawled to where Clayton lay. "We must draw once more before we are too weak even to eat," he whispered. Clayton was in such a state that he was scarcely master of his own will. Jane Porter had not spoken for 3 days. He knew that she was dying. Horrible as the thought was, he hoped that the sacrifice of either Tarzan or himself might be the means of giving her renewed strength, and so he immediately agreed to the Russian's proposal. They drew under the same plan as before, but there could be but one result. Clayton drew the 1875 piece. "When shall it be?" he asked Tarzan. The Russian had already drawn a pocket knife from his trousers and was weakly attempting to open it. Now he muttered, and his greedy eyes gloated upon the Englishman. "Can't you wait until dark?" asked Clayton. "Miss Porter must not see this thing done. We were to have been married, you know." A look of disappointment came over Monsieur Tarzan's face. "Very well," he replied hesitatingly. "It will not be long until night. I have waited for many days. I can wait a few hours longer." "Thank you, my friend," murmured Clayton. "Now I shall go to her side and remain with her until it is time. I would like to have an hour or two with her before I die." When Clayton reached the girl's side, she was unconscious. He knew that she was dying, and he was glad that she should not have to see or know the awful tragedy that was shortly to be enacted. He took her hand and raised it to his cracked and swollen lips. For a long time he lay caressing the emaciated, claw-like thing that had once been the beautiful, shapely white hand of the young Baltimore belle. It was quite dark before he knew it, but he was recalled to himself by a voice out of the night. It was the Russian calling him to his doom. "I am coming, Monsieur Tarzan," he hastened to reply. Thrice he attempted to turn himself upon his hands and knees, that he might crawl back to his death, but in the few hours that he had lain there he had become too weak to return to Tarzan's side. "You will have to come to me, monsieur," he called weakly. "I have not sufficient strength to gain my hands and knees." "Sapristi," muttered Monsieur Tarzan, "you are attempting to cheat me out of my winnings." Clayton heard the man shuffling about in the bottom of the boat. Finally there was a despairing groan. "I cannot crawl," he heard the Russian wail. "It is too late. You have tricked me, you dirty English dog." "I have not tricked you, monsieur," replied Clayton. "I have done my best to rise, but I shall try again, and if you will try, possibly each of us can crawl halfway, and then you shall have your winnings." Again Clayton exerted his remaining strength to the utmost, and he heard Tarzan apparently doing the same. Nearly an hour later the Englishman succeeded in raising himself to his hands and knees, but at the first forward movement he pitched upon his face. A moment later he heard an exclamation of relief from Monsieur Tarzan. "I am coming," whispered the Russian. Again Clayton essayed to stagger on to meet his fate, but once more he pitched headlong to the boat's bottom, nor, try as he would, could he again rise. His last effort caused him to roll over on his back, and there he lay looking up at the stars, while behind him, coming ever nearer and nearer, he could hear the laborious shuffling and the stertorous breathing of the Russian. It seemed that he must have lain thus an hour waiting for the thing to crawl out of the dark and end his misery. It was quite close now, but there were longer and longer pauses between its efforts to advance, and each forward movement seemed to the waiting Englishman to be almost imperceptible. Finally he knew that Tarzan was quite close beside him. He heard a cackling laugh, something touched his face, and he lost consciousness.